In a quiet small town, a courageous act of bravery by Daryl, a 35-year-old black mechanic, unexpectedly turns his life upside down. When Daryl, a former firefighter with a painful past, risks everything to save Officer Bradley, a white cop, from a fiery car crash, he never imagined that his simple act of kindness would lead to such dramatic changes. What was it about this seemingly straightforward act of heroism that set off a chain of events that changed everything for Daryl? And how did his selfless actions lead to a journey of personal growth and societal impact? Stay tuned to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy this tale of bravery and transformation, don't forget to subscribe. Daryl was a man of routine. At 35 years old, he had learned to appreciate the quiet life. Each day followed the same pattern. Waking up early in his modest home on the edge of town, heading to his garage where he worked as a mechanic, and returning home to a simple dinner before turning in for the night. It was a life that offered stability, something Daryl had come to value deeply after the chaos of his past. Daryl wasn't always a mechanic. There was a time when he wore a different uniform, a firefighter's uniform. He had been one of the best, known for his quick thinking and courage under pressure. But that was before the accident, before the day that changed everything. The incident was something Daryl seldom spoke about, even to those closest to him. It had been a routine call, or so it seemed at first. A fire had broken out in an old apartment building, and Daryl had been among the first responders. He was the one who went in, climbing up to the fourth floor where they believed a child was trapped. The flames were intense, hotter than anything he had ever faced before. The smoke was so thick that it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. But Daryl pushed forward, relying on his training and instincts. He found the child, a little boy no older than 5, huddled in a corner, terrified. Daryl grabbed him, shielding him with his own body as he made his way back through the inferno. But as he neared the stairwell, something went wrong. A beam, weakened by the fire, gave way and crashed down, pinning Daryl's leg. The pain was excruciating, but he didn't let go of the boy. With every ounce of strength he had, he managed to free himself and get the child to safety. When Daryl finally emerged from the building, he collapsed. His leg was badly injured, but worse than that were the scars left on his mind. The nightmares started soon after, vivid and relentless. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that burning building, the heat suffocating, the screams of the child echoing in his ears. Daryl couldn't shake the fear that he would fail next time, that someone wouldn't make it out because of him. The physical injuries healed, but the psychological ones did not. After months of struggling, Daryl made the decision to leave the fire department. It was the hardest choice he ever made, walking away from the job he loved, but he knew he couldn't continue. The fear had taken hold of him, and it wouldn't let go. Now, Daryl found solace in the simplicity of working on cars. Engines were predictable, unlike the fires that had haunted him. He could fix a car, make it run smoothly again. It was something tangible, something that didn't require him to risk his life or face the terror of the unknown. And in this small town, far from the bustle of the city, he felt he could finally find peace. But peace was a fragile thing in this town. Beneath the surface of everyday life, there was tension, a tension that Daryl was all too aware of. The town had its divides, and one of the most pronounced was between the black community and the police force. It was an old story, one that played out in small ways every day. Daryl had seen it in the suspicious glances cast his way when he walked down the street, in the way conversations would shift when he entered a room, in the way some of the officers would look at him as if expecting trouble. He did his best to avoid conflict, keeping his head down and staying out of trouble. Daryl wasn't one to stir the pot, especially not in a town where the lines were so clearly drawn. He knew the rules of the game, knew how to navigate the subtle, unspoken tensions that simmered just below the surface. But that didn't mean it didn't weigh on him. The police in the town were a mixed bunch, but one officer in particular had a reputation that preceded him. Officer Bradley. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a square jaw and a stern expression, Bradley was known for being tough. Some might have called him fair, but others, especially within the black community, had different words to describe him. Darrell had never had a direct run-in with Bradley, but he'd heard the stories of stops that seemed unnecessary, of words exchanged that left a bitter taste. Bradley was the kind of cop who believed in law and order, but for some, that order came at a cost. It was late one evening, just after sunset, when Darrell found himself driving home from the garage. The day had been a long one, and he was looking forward to getting back, kicking off his boots, and settling in for the night. The road was quiet, as it usually was at this time, with only the occasional car passing by. Darrell liked the quiet. It gave him time to think, to let the hum of the engine soothe his mind. He was nearing a curve in the road when he saw it, a flash of movement, a blur of metal, and then the sound of screeching tires. In the blink of an eye, a car veered off the road, crashing through the guardrail and tumbling down the embankment. For a moment, everything was silent, and then the night was split by the sound of an explosion. Darrell's heart leaped into his throat. He slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding to a halt on the side of the road. Without a second thought, he jumped out and ran toward the wreckage. As he approached, he could see the flames licking up from the hood of the car, the acrid smell of burning fuel filling the air. It was a scene straight out of his nightmares, the fire so intense that it made his skin prickle with fear. But there was no time to think, no time to let the fear take hold. Darrell's instincts kicked in, the training that had been drilled into him over years of service as a firefighter. He could see someone inside the car, slumped over the steering wheel, the seatbelt holding them in place. He didn't need to get closer to recognize the uniform, the navy blue of a police officer. Darrell's mind raced. He knew the car could explode at any moment, that the flames could engulf it completely before he could get the person out. But he couldn't just stand there. He couldn't let someone die, not like this. He ran to the car, pulling off his jacket and wrapping it around his hands to protect them from the heat. The door was jammed, bent out of shape from the impact, but Darrell braced himself and pulled with all his strength. The metal groaned in protest, but it finally gave way, and he wrenched the door open. The officer inside was barely conscious, his head lolling to the side. Blood trickled down from a gash on his forehead, and his breaths were shallow. Darrell reached in, unbuckling the seatbelt and grabbing the officer under the arms. He was heavy, dead weight in Darrell's grip, but Darrell didn't let that stop him. He dragged the officer out of the car, pulling him away from the flames that were growing higher by the second. They were only a few feet away when the car exploded, the force of the blast knocking Darrell to the ground. He shielded the officer with his body as debris rained down around them. The heat was intense, singeing the hairs on the back of Darrell's neck, but they were out of immediate danger. Darrell lay there for a moment, catching his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the officer's faint pulse under his fingers, a sign that he was still alive. Slowly, Darrell got to his feet, lifting the officer with him and carrying him further away from the burning wreckage. The adrenaline was wearing off now, and the pain in Darrell's leg was beginning to make itself known. He'd strained it in the effort to pull the officer free, and every step sent a jolt of pain up his spine. But he kept going, determined to get the officer to safety. Finally, he reached the top of the embankment and gently laid the officer down on the grass by the side of the road. The flames from the car lit up the night, casting flickering shadows across the officer's face. It was only then that Darrell got a good look at him, Officer Bradley. Darrell's breath caught in his throat. Of all the people it could have been, it had to be Bradley. The man who had come to symbolize everything Darrell tried to avoid in this town. The man who, in another life, might have been the one to arrest him for something as simple as a broken taillight. But none of that mattered now. Darrell had saved his life, and that was all there was to it. He could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Help was on the way, but Darrell didn't wait. He had done what he could, and now it was time to leave. He didn't need the attention, didn't want the questions that would inevitably follow. He just wanted to go home, to return to the quiet life he had worked so hard to build. With one last glance at Bradley, who was beginning to stir, Darrell turned and walked away, the sound of the approaching sirens fading into the background as he headed back to his truck. His leg throbbed with each step, a reminder of the risk he had just taken. But as he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, he knew he had done the right thing. The road stretched out before him, dark and empty, and Darrell drove on, his mind a whirl of thoughts and emotions. The night had taken a turn he never could have expected, and he had no idea what the consequences would be. But for now, he just needed to get home, to find some semblance of peace in the aftermath of what had just happened. Darrell had always tried to stay out of the fray, to live his life quietly and without conflict. But tonight had reminded him that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, life has a way of pulling you back into the fire. Darrell drove home in a daze, his mind replaying the night's events over and over. He couldn't shake the image of the burning car or the feeling of Bradley's weight in his arms as he pulled him to safety. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a deep exhaustion and a lingering unease. He had done something good, something that should have made him feel proud. But instead, all he felt was a heavy sense of dread. He arrived at his small, modest home and parked the truck in the driveway. The house was dark, except for the dim porch light he always left on. As he stepped out of the truck, his leg throbbed in protest, a sharp reminder of the strain he'd put on it. He limped up the steps and unlocked the door, the quiet of the house greeting him like an old friend. Darrell had always found solace in the silence, but tonight it felt oppressive, the weight of what had happened pressing down on him. He went straight to the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water and downing it in one gulp. The cold liquid did little to calm his racing thoughts. His hands trembled as he set the glass down on the counter, the events of the night catching up to him all at once. He had saved a life, Bradley's life. The same Officer Bradley who had looked at him with suspicion, who had always been quick to assume the worst about men who looked like him. Darrell couldn't help but wonder how Bradley would react when he found out who had pulled him from that car. Would he be grateful? Would he even care? Or would he dismiss it as just another part of the job, something that didn't require acknowledgement? Darrell wasn't sure, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. He had never sought recognition for anything he did, and he certainly didn't want it now. But he couldn't deny the knot of anxiety forming in his stomach at the thought of what might come next. Darrell shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He needed to sleep, to put this night behind him and move on. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and he needed to be ready for whatever came his way. He made his way to the bedroom, where he collapsed onto the bed, still fully dressed. But sleep didn't come easily. His mind was too busy, too full of the flames, the heat, and the weight of a man's life in his hands. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and he drifted off into a restless sleep, the echoes of the night's events still lingering in the corners of his mind. The next morning, Darrell awoke to the sound of his phone vibrating on the nightstand. He groggily reached for it, squinting at the screen. There were multiple missed calls and messages, all from numbers he didn't recognize. His heart sank, as he realized what this likely meant. News traveled fast in a small town, especially news as dramatic as a car crash and a daring rescue. He reluctantly opened one of the messages, his eyes scanning the words quickly. It was from a local reporter, asking for an interview about the heroic rescue he had performed the night before. Daryl's stomach twisted in knots. He had hoped to avoid attention, to slip back into his quiet life without anyone noticing. But it seemed that wasn't going to happen. He tossed the phone back on the nightstand and buried his face in his hands. This was exactly what he didn't want. He wasn't looking for praise or recognition. He had done what anyone in his position would have done, or at least what he hoped anyone would do. But now, the town was abuzz with the story, and there was no escaping it. Daryl forced himself to get up and go about his day. He had work to do, and he couldn't afford to let this distract him. But as he drove to the garage, the weight of the situation hung over him like a cloud. The town had always been a place where he could blend in, where he could live his life without drawing too much attention. But now, everything had changed. When he arrived at the garage, he found his boss, Frank, waiting for him. Frank was a burly man in his 50s, with a salt-and-pepper beard and a no-nonsense attitude. He had always treated Daryl fairly, never prying into his personal life or pushing him to talk about his past. But today, Frank's expression was different. There was a mixture of concern and curiosity in his eyes. "Morning, Daryl," Frank greeted him, his voice gruff but warm. "Morning," Daryl replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. He wasn't in the mood for small talk, but he knew he couldn't avoid it. Frank rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "I heard about what happened last night. Hell of a thing you did, saving that cop." Daryl shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just did what I had to do." Frank nodded slowly, his eyes searching Daryl's face. "Yeah, well, not everyone would have done the same, especially not for a guy like Bradley." There it was, the unspoken truth that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say outright. Daryl knew the town was divided on Bradley. Some saw him as a necessary force, someone who kept order in a place that needed it. But others, especially those in the black community, saw him as a problem, a man who enforced the law with a heavy hand and little understanding. "Doesn't matter who it was," Daryl said, his voice firm. "A life's a life." Frank studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "You're a good man, Daryl. Just don't let this town chew you up over it." Daryl managed a small smile, grateful for Frank's understanding. "I won't." But as the day wore on, Daryl found it harder and harder to focus. The calls kept coming, and eventually he had to turn his phone off just to get some peace. Word had spread quickly, and by the afternoon, it seemed like everyone in town knew what had happened. Customers at the garage either gave him lingering looks or asked him outright about the rescue, and Daryl had to fight the urge to just walk away from it all. He hadn't asked for this attention, and he certainly didn't want it. But it was clear that the town wasn't going to let it go so easily. A few days later, as Daryl was finishing up a repair job, Frank approached him with a serious look on his face. "Daryl, there's someone here to see you," Frank said, nodding toward the office. Daryl wiped his hands on a rag, his stomach churning with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. He had a feeling he knew who it was, but he wasn't sure he was ready to face him. He walked to the office and paused at the door. Standing there, looking slightly out of place in his uniform, was Officer Bradley. His head was still bandaged from the accident, and he moved with a slight stiffness, but his expression was unreadable. "Officer Bradley." Daryl greeted him cautiously, not sure what to expect. "Daryl," Bradley replied, his voice gruff but not unkind. I wanted to thank you for what you did." Daryl nodded, unsure of what to say. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. Daryl had spent years avoiding men like Bradley, knowing that any interaction could quickly turn sour. But now, Here they were, face to face, brought together by something neither of them had expected. Bradley shifted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable. I know we don't see eye to eye on a lot of things, but you saved my life. I didn't expect that, especially not from someone like you. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Daryl bristled at the implication, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was a delicate moment, one that could easily go wrong if he wasn't careful. Someone like me? Daryl repeated, his voice steady but with an edge of challenge. Bradley met his gaze, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or maybe just realization. I didn't mean it like that, he said quickly. I didn't think anyone would risk their life for me, given, well, everything. Daryl let out a slow breath, trying to release the tension that had built up in his chest. I wasn't thinking about who you were, he said honestly. I just saw someone who needed help. Bradley nodded, his expression softening slightly. Well, I appreciate it. More than you know. There was a long pause, the silence between them filled with unspoken understanding. For the first time, Daryl saw something different in Bradley's eyes. A recognition that went beyond the uniform, beyond the roles they had both been forced into by the town's unspoken rules. It was a moment of connection, however fleeting, that transcended the divides that had always kept them apart. I'm glad you're okay, Daryl said finally, breaking the silence. Thanks, Bradley replied. I owe you one. Daryl shook his head. You don't owe me anything. But Bradley's expression remained serious. Maybe not, but I want you to know that I'm grateful. And I'll think about things differently from now on. Daryl didn't know if Bradley's words would lead to any real change, but for now, it was enough. The meeting ended with a brief, awkward handshake, and Bradley left the garage, leaving Daryl alone with his thoughts once again. The morning after Daryl's tense meeting with Officer Bradley, he awoke to a sense of uneasy calm. The town had not quieted down, and neither had the internal storm brewing within him. He had spent the night tossing and turning, replaying the events of the past few days in his mind. The conversations, the stares, the expectations, they all weighed heavily on him, like an anchor dragging him down into waters he didn't want to tread. As he prepared for the day, the nagging feeling of something impending lingered. He wasn't sure what it was, but he couldn't shake it. His phone, which he had turned back on only an hour ago, buzzed incessantly with missed calls and messages. The events of the past few days had put him under a spotlight he neither asked for nor wanted. Just as he sat down with his morning coffee, the phone rang again. Daryl glanced at the screen, expecting another reporter or a well-meaning acquaintance. But the name that flashed across the screen was unfamiliar. He hesitated for a moment before picking it up. Hello, Daryl answered, his voice gruff from the lack of sleep. Good morning, Mr. Adams. The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, with a tone that commanded attention. My name is Angela Pearson. I'm a civil rights lawyer based in Atlanta. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Daryl's brow furrowed. A lawyer? His instinct was to hang up, to avoid whatever this was going to be, but something in her voice made him pause. Oh, no, it's fine. What can I do for you? I've been following the news about your heroic actions the other night, Angela continued, her tone gentle but firm. What you did, saving Officer Bradley from that burning car, it's something remarkable. But what's even more remarkable is the context. A black man saving a white officer in a town like yours, it's a story that needs to be told. Daryl's hand tightened around his coffee mug. He could feel where this was going, and he didn't like it. I'm not looking for attention, Miss Pearson. I just did what anyone else would have done. I understand that, Angela replied, her voice understanding but persistent. But the truth is, not everyone would have done what you did. The story of your bravery, especially in the context of our current climate, could have a powerful impact. I'm not talking about turning you into some kind of celebrity, Daryl. I'm talking about using your story to highlight the larger issues: racial inequality, the relationship between black communities and law enforcement, the need for change. Daryl exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. I'm just a regular guy. I don't have anything to say that hasn't been said before. Angela paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Maybe so, but your actions speak louder than words ever could. People are listening, Daryl. They want to hear from someone like you, someone who has lived through it, who understands the complexities of race and justice in America. You have the power to reach people in a way that few others can. Daryl felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had spent most of his life trying to stay under the radar to avoid becoming a target. The idea of stepping into the spotlight, even for a good cause, was terrifying. I don't know if I'm the right person for this, Daryl said quietly, the uncertainty clear in his voice. I'm not a speaker. I don't even like talking to people that much. Angela chuckled softly, sensing his discomfort. You don't have to be a polished speaker or an activist to make a difference, Daryl. You just have to be yourself. People connect with authenticity, with real stories from real people. And right now, the world could use more of that. Daryl remained silent, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. He had always believed in doing the right thing, in helping others when he could. But this was different. This wasn't just about saving a life. This was about stepping into a role he wasn't sure he could fill. Angela seemed to sense his hesitation. I'm not asking you to decide right now. Take some time to think about it. But I believe your story could change lives, Daryl. It could inspire others, bring attention to the issues that need it most. And it could help you to give you a platform to share your truth, to make your voice heard. Daryl nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I'll think about it, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. Thank you, Daryl, Angela replied, her tone sincere. I know this isn't an easy decision, but whatever you decide, know that you've already made a difference just by being who you are. The call ended with a polite goodbye, and Daryl was left staring at his phone, the screen now dark. He set it down on the table and leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling as if the answers he sought might be written there. He had never wanted to be a hero, never wanted to be anything other than who he was, a man trying to live his life as best as he could. But now, he was faced with a choice that could change everything, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. As the day wore on, Daryl couldn't shake the conversation he'd had with Angela Pearson. Her words echoed in his mind, intertwining with his own fears and doubts. He had always believed in doing the right thing, but this felt like more than just doing the right thing. This felt like stepping into a world he had no experience in, a world that could chew him up and spit him out if he wasn't careful. He decided to take a drive, hoping the familiar roads and open air would help clear his mind. As he navigated the winding streets of the town, memories of his past began to surface. Memories of growing up in a place where the lines between right and wrong were often blurred by prejudice and fear. Daryl had always been aware of the unspoken rules that governed his life, the invisible boundaries that dictated where he could go, who he could talk to, and how he was expected to behave. It was a reality he had learned to navigate from a young age, one that had shaped him into the man he was today. A man who kept his head down, who didn't make waves, who did what he could to survive in a world that wasn't always kind to men like him. But now he was being asked to do the opposite, to step into the light, to make waves, to use his voice to speak out against the very injustices he had spent his life trying to avoid. It was a daunting prospect, one that filled him with equal parts fear and doubt. As he drove past the old high school, memories of his teenage years flooded back. He remembered the whispers, the sideways glances, the subtle but unmistakable reminders that he was different, that he didn't quite belong. He had learned to ignore them, to focus on what he could control: his work, his family, his own sense of integrity. But the scars of those years had never fully healed, and now they were being ripped open again. Daryl pulled over to the side of the road, staring out at the empty football field where he had once played. He had been good, really good. There had even been talk of college scholarships, of a future beyond the small town that had always felt too confining. But those dreams had been dashed by a knee injury that never quite healed, and Daryl had found himself back where he started, working odd jobs and trying to make ends meet. He had accepted his fate, had made peace with the life he was living. But now, the call from Angela Pearson had stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of possibility, of purpose. But with it came the fear of stepping out of the shadows, of exposing himself to a world that wasn't always kind to men like him. He thought about his family, about the sacrifices they had made to get him to where he was today. His parents, who had worked themselves to the bone to provide for him and his siblings. His sister, Tanya, who had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. They had all faced their own struggles, their own battles against the world's injustices. And they had done so with quiet dignity, with strength and resilience that Daryl had always admired. What would they think of him now? Would they support him in this new endeavor? Or would they worry that he was biting off more than he could chew? Daryl wasn't sure, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. He decided to visit his sister, knowing that she would give him the honest advice he needed. Tanya had always been his sounding board, the one person he could count on to tell him the truth, even when it was hard to hear. As he pulled into her driveway, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. If anyone could help him make sense of this, it was Tanya. Tanya greeted him with a warm smile as she opened the door, her eyes filled with concern as she took in the look on his face. "Daryl, what's going on? You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders," she said, leading him into the living room. Daryl sat down on the worn couch, letting out a heavy sigh. "I don't even know where to start, Tanya. I got a call this morning from a civil rights lawyer. She wants me to share my story, to talk about what happened with Bradley, and use it as a platform to address racial inequality. She thinks it can make a difference, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for this." Tanya sat beside him, her expression thoughtful. "Wow, that's big. I can see why you're struggling with it. But Daryl, you've always been someone who stands up for what's right. Maybe this is just another way of doing that." "I don't know if I can do it," Daryl admitted, his voice filled with doubt. "I'm not a public speaker, Tanya. I'm just a guy who fixes cars. And besides, what if it backfires? What if it brings more trouble than good?" Tanya placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady. "It's a risk, sure, but change doesn't come without risk. Think about all the people who have spoken up, who have put themselves out there to make the world a better place. They were just regular people too, Daryl. They didn't have all the answers, but they had the courage to try." Daryl leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I've always tried to stay under the radar, you know that. I've seen what happens when you get too much attention, especially in a town like this. People start looking at you differently, expecting things from you. I'm not sure I want that kind of life." Tanya nodded, understanding his concerns. "I get it, but you're not the same person you were back then. You've grown, you've changed, and maybe it's time to step out of the shadows, to use your voice, your experiences, to help others. You don't have to become some big-time activist, Daryl. You just have to be you." Daryl looked at his sister, searching for the reassurance he needed. "But what if it doesn't work out? What if I make things worse?" Tanya smiled softly. "You won't know until you try. And even if it doesn't go the way you hope, at least you'll know you did something. That you didn't just stand by and let things happen. That counts for something, Daryl." He nodded slowly, the weight of the decision still pressing down on him. I just don't want to make a mistake, Tanya. I don't want to regret this. You won't, Tanya said firmly, because whatever happens, you'll be doing it for the right reasons. And that's all that matters. Darryl sat in silence for a moment, letting her words sink in. He knew she was right, but the fear still lingered. The fear of stepping into a world he didn't understand, of becoming a symbol he wasn't sure he could live up to. But beneath that fear was something else, something that had been growing inside him since the moment he pulled Bradley from that burning car. A sense of purpose, of responsibility. I'll think about it, he finally said, his voice quiet but resolute. Tanya smiled, squeezing his hand. That's all you can do, Darryl. Take your time and make the decision that feels right for you. Just know that whatever you decide, I'm proud of you. We all are. Darryl felt a wave of emotion wash over him. The love and support of his sister giving him the strength he needed to face the uncertainty ahead. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone in this. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Over the next few days, Darryl found himself in constant internal debate. The call from Angela Pearson played on repeat in his mind, her words mixing with the voices of his family and friends. He spoke with a few close confidants, each offering their own perspective on the situation. Some, like his childhood friend Jerome, were cautious. Man, you know how people get when you start talking about race and cops, Jerome warned during a late-night phone call. This could bring a lot of heat your way. You've got to be ready for that. Jerome's words echoed Darryl's own fears, but they also made him think harder about the stakes. He knew that what happened between him and Officer Bradley was more than just a dramatic rescue. It was a moment that could symbolize something larger, something important. Yet, the idea of becoming a public figure, of having his life scrutinized and dissected, still frightened him. On the other hand, his cousin Malik had a different take. Darryl, this is your shot, man, Malik said, his voice crackling over the phone. You've got a chance to say something real, to stand up for all the folks who never get heard. People need to see that things can change, that we can make things better if we speak out. Don't let this pass you by. Malik's enthusiasm was contagious, and it sparked a feeling in Darryl that he hadn't felt in years. The idea of making a difference, of using his story to help others, was appealing. But the fear of failure, of not living up to the expectations placed on him, still lingered. As the days passed, Darryl kept to himself more than usual, avoiding the public eye as much as possible. He spent hours alone, walking through the woods behind his house, trying to sort through his thoughts. He thought about his past, about the times he had stayed silent when he wanted to speak up, about the moments when he could have made a difference but didn't. He didn't want this to be another one of those times. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun set, his father, old and wise beyond his years, joined him. The two men sat in silence for a while, the quiet between them filled with unspoken understanding. Your sister tells me you've got a big decision to make, his father said eventually, his voice gravelly but gentle. Darryl nodded, staring out at the horizon. Yeah, it feels like no matter what I choose, there's a part of me that's going to regret it. His father chuckled softly. Regret's part of life, son. But the real question is, which regret can you live with? The regret of doing something and it not going how you hoped, or the regret of not doing anything and wondering what could have been. Darryl turned to look at his father, the wisdom in his words striking a chord deep within him. His father had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was worth listening. I just don't want to make a mistake, Darryl admitted, his voice heavy with uncertainty. Mistakes are how we learn, his father replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. What matters is that you follow your heart. Do what feels right to you, not what anyone else thinks you should do. At the end of the day, You're the one who has to live with your choices. Daryl sighed, the tension in his chest easing just a little. But what if I'm not ready? What if I'm not the right person for this? His father patted him on the back, his touch reassuring. Son, none of us ever feel ready when it comes to doing something big. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. You're a good man, Daryl. You've got a good heart, and that's what people need to see. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be you. The simplicity of his father's words brought Daryl a sense of peace he hadn't felt in days. He didn't have to be a hero. He didn't have to be a public speaker or an activist. He just had to be himself. A man who believed in doing the right thing, who wanted to make a difference in his own way. That night, as he lay in bed, Daryl made his decision. He didn't know what the future would hold, and he was still scared of the unknown. But he knew that if he didn't take this chance, he would always wonder what could have been, and that, he realized, was a regret he couldn't live with. Daryl sat in his garage, the echo of his own thoughts drowning out the steady hum of the tools and machinery around him. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind, one he had never expected to be caught up in. What started as an act of bravery, born from instinct and compassion, had spiraled into something much bigger than himself. The attention his story was receiving was both empowering and terrifying. As much as he wanted to make a difference, the pushback from certain corners of the town had been a bitter pill to swallow. The news had spread fast. Daryl's story had been picked up by local media, and before long, it had gained national attention. But with the attention came division. The town, already simmering with underlying racial tensions, began to crack under the pressure. Conversations that had been whispered behind closed doors were now being shouted in the streets, and Daryl found himself at the center of it all. Some of the town's leaders had tried to downplay the racial aspect of the story, insisting that it was simply a tale of heroism with no need for deeper analysis. Why bring race into it? They asked, as if race had ever been something that could be left out of the equation. Others saw the situation as an opportunity to finally address the long-standing issues that had plagued the community for years. These voices were louder, more passionate, and they saw Daryl as a symbol of change. But not everyone was supportive. In fact, the backlash had been more severe than Daryl had anticipated. He had expected some resistance, people who didn't like the idea of stirring the pot. But the level of animosity took him by surprise. Old tensions resurfaced, and the whispers that had once been kept behind closed doors were now out in the open. The first sign of real trouble came when Daryl found his garage vandalized. It was a quiet morning when he arrived at work, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon. As he pulled up to the garage, his heart sank. Spray-painted across the front of the building were words he hadn't heard in years, words that cut deeper than any knife. Go back where you came from. Traitor. The bright red letters were angry, violent, and they struck Daryl like a punch to the gut. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the words, the weight of them pressing down on his chest. For a moment, he considered turning around, getting in his car, and driving away, leaving the town and all its problems behind. But he knew he couldn't do that. This was his home, for better or worse, and he wasn't going to let fear drive him away. Daryl spent the rest of the morning cleaning the graffiti off the walls, scrubbing until his hands were raw and the hateful words were nothing more than a memory. But the pain they caused lingered, and it was a reminder that not everyone in the town was ready for change. As he worked, Daryl's thoughts drifted to the people who had supported him, the ones who had encouraged him to speak out. His family, his friends, people like Angela Pearson, who had taken an interest in his story and believed in the power it had to bring about change. But with their support came expectations, and Daryl was struggling under the weight of them. Later that afternoon, as Daryl was finishing up for the day, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching the garage. He looked up to see Officer Bradley standing in the doorway, his face drawn and serious. Daryl's first instinct was to tense up. He hadn't seen Bradley since the hospital visit, and he wasn't sure what to expect. "Daryl," Bradley said, his voice quiet but firm. "Can we talk?" Daryl nodded, wiping his hands on a rag before gesturing for Bradley to come inside. The officer stepped into the garage, his eyes scanning the space before settling on the remnants of the vandalism. He didn't say anything at first, but Daryl could see the conflict in his eyes. "I heard about what happened," Bradley finally said, his voice tinged with regret. "I'm sorry." Daryl shrugged, trying to play it off as no big deal, but the truth was it had shaken him. "It's not the first time something like this has happened," he replied, his voice calm but edged with bitterness. "And it probably won't be the last." Bradley nodded, his expression somber. "I know things have been tough for you. I've been thinking a lot about what you did for me that night, and I realized I've been wrong about a lot of things." Daryl raised an eyebrow, surprised by the admission. Bradley wasn't the type to admit fault easily, and this was a side of the officer he hadn't seen before. "Look," Bradley continued, "I've spent a lot of years seeing things a certain way, and I know I've hurt people because of it. People like you, and I'm not proud of that. But what you did that night, it made me realize that I need to change. I want to change." Daryl listened in silence, his emotions a mix of skepticism and hope. He wanted to believe that Bradley was sincere, that this wasn't just another empty apology. But trust was hard to come by in a town like theirs, and Daryl had learned the hard way that words didn't always lead to actions. "I've seen the way the town's been reacting to your story," Bradley went on, his voice growing more urgent. "And I know it's been tough. But Daryl, you have a chance to make a real difference here. People are listening to you. They're paying attention. If you speak up, if you take this platform that's being offered to you, you could help change things for the better." Daryl felt a lump form in his throat. The words he had been hearing from so many others were now coming from the last person he expected. He had always seen Bradley as part of the problem, but here he was, urging him to take a stand. "I'm just a mechanic, Bradley," Daryl said, his voice laced with frustration. "I'm not some kind of activist or leader. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to help someone in need. That's it." "I know," Bradley replied, his eyes pleading. "And that's exactly why you're the right person for this. People don't need another politician or preacher telling them what to think. They need someone real, someone who's been through it, who understands what it's like to live with this every day. You have the power to make them see things differently, Daryl. Don't let that go to waste." Daryl sighed, running a hand through his hair as he considered Bradley's words. It was a lot to take in, and the pressure of it all was overwhelming. But deep down, he knew that Bradley was right. He had been given an opportunity to make a difference, and turning away from it felt like the easy way out. Daryl looked into Bradley's eyes, searching for any sign of insincerity, but all he saw was a man who was genuinely trying to make amends. It wasn't an easy decision, but in that moment, Daryl knew what he had to do. As Bradley left the garage, Daryl felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. The following days were a blur of preparation. Daryl worked closely with Angela Pearson, who helped him refine his story and prepare for the public speaking events that were being lined up. It was a new world for Daryl, one filled with interviews, meetings, and rehearsals. But through it all, he kept his focus on the message he wanted to convey. The day of the first public speaking event arrived faster than Daryl had anticipated. It was held at the local community center, a modest building that had seen its share of town meetings and social gatherings over the years. The event had been widely publicized, and the turnout was larger than anyone had expected. The room was packed, with people standing in the aisles and lining the walls, eager to hear what Daryl had to say. Daryl stood backstage, his heart pounding in his chest as he listened to the murmur of the crowd. Angela was beside him, offering last-minute encouragement. "You've got this, Daryl," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. "Just speak from the heart. That's all you need to do." Daryl nodded, taking a deep breath as he prepared to step out onto the stage. The lights were bright, almost blinding, but as he looked out at the sea of faces before him, he felt a wave of calm wash over him. This was his moment, and he was ready. He began by telling the story of what had happened that night on the icy road, recounting the events that had led him to save Officer Bradley's life. The room was silent, hanging on his every word. But it wasn't just the story of the rescue that he wanted to share. It was the larger story, the one about the town, the community, and the changes that were desperately needed. Daryl spoke about the racism and prejudice that had been a part of his life for as long as he could remember. He talked about the challenges he had faced, not just as a black man, but as a human being trying to make a life for himself in a world that often seemed determined to hold him back. He shared his fears, his doubts, and the moments of despair that had nearly broken him. But he also spoke about hope. Hope for a future where people could come together, despite their differences, and work towards a better, more just society. He urged the audience to look beyond the surface, to see each other as individuals with unique stories and experiences, rather than as members of different races or social classes. As Daryl spoke, he could feel the mood in the room shifting. The anger and division that had been so palpable in the town seemed to melt away, replaced by a sense of unity and shared purpose. When he finished, the room erupted into applause, thunderous, heartfelt applause that brought tears to his eyes. In that moment, Daryl knew that he had made the right decision. The road ahead would still be difficult, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges to face, but he was no longer afraid. He had found his voice, and he was determined to use it to make a difference. As he stepped off the stage, his family rushed to greet him, their faces beaming with pride. His father pulled him into a tight embrace, his voice choked with emotion. "You did good, son. You did real good." Daryl smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment that he had never known before. He had faced his fears, confronted the demons of his past, and come out stronger on the other side. And as he looked around at the people who had come to support him, he knew that he wasn't alone. Together, they would work to build a better future, one where stories like his wouldn't need to be told because the world would finally have changed for the better. In the weeks that followed, Daryl's story continued to gain traction. He was invited to speak at schools, community centers, and even city halls in neighboring towns. The impact of his words was undeniable. People were listening, and more importantly, they were starting to act. The town, once divided, began to come together in ways that Daryl hadn't thought possible. Conversations about race and equality became more frequent, and the community started to take steps towards addressing the deep-seated issues that had plagued it for so long. Officer Bradley, too, underwent a transformation. He became an advocate for change within the police department, pushing for reforms and working to build bridges between the police and the community. It wasn't an easy process, but with Daryl's story as a catalyst, the momentum for change was undeniable. Daryl's life had changed in ways he could never have imagined, and while the journey had been difficult, he knew that it had all been worth it. He had found his purpose, and with it, a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. As he stood in his garage one evening, looking out at the town that had become his home, Daryl felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had faced the challenges head-on, and in doing so, he had helped to create a better future for himself, his family, and his community. And as the sun set on another day, Daryl knew that the work was far from over. But with the support of those around him, he was ready to continue the fight for justice, equality, and a better tomorrow. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as Darrell pulled into the parking lot of his garage. It had been 6 months since that fateful night when he had saved Officer Bradley from the burning car. And in that time, his life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. As he stepped out of his truck, he paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the building before him. The walls that had once been marred by hateful graffiti now bore a mural, a beautiful depiction of hands of different colors clasped together in unity. It was a symbol of how far the town had come, and a reminder of how much further they still had to go. Darrell unlocked the door and flipped on the lights, the familiar smell of oil and rubber greeting him like an old friend. He had always found comfort in the routine of his work, in the simplicity of fixing what was broken. But these days, his work extended far beyond the walls of his garage. He had become a voice for change, a beacon of hope for those who had long felt unheard and unseen. As he settled into his morning routine, checking his appointment book and preparing for the day ahead, Darrell's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Angela Pearson, the civil rights lawyer who had first reached out to him all those months ago. "Big news, Darrell. Can you meet me for lunch today? There's something important we need to discuss." Darrell felt a familiar flutter of nervousness in his stomach. Every time Angela contacted him with big news, it seemed to lead to another step in his unexpected journey as an activist. He quickly typed out a reply, agreeing to meet her at their usual spot, a small diner on the edge of town that had become something of a headquarters for their efforts. The morning passed in a blur of oil, changes, and tire rotations, the steady work of his hands a welcome distraction from the anticipation building inside him. As noon approached, Darrell cleaned up and headed to the diner, his mind racing with possibilities of what Angela might want to discuss. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and he spotted Angela immediately, sitting in their usual booth by the window. She looked up as he approached, a smile spreading across her face. "Darrell," she greeted him warmly, gesturing for him to sit. "Thanks for meeting me on such short notice." Darrell slid into the booth across from her, nodding to the waitress who immediately brought over a cup of coffee. "No problem, Angela. What's this big news you mentioned?" Angela leaned forward, her eyes shining with excitement. "I just got off the phone with the governor's office. They want you to speak at the state capitol next month. They're holding a special session on police reform and community relations, and they think your story could be a powerful catalyst for change." Darrell felt his breath catch in his throat. Speaking at the local community center was one thing, but the state capitol? That was a whole different ballgame. "I don't know, Angela," he said hesitantly. "That's a pretty big stage. Are you sure I'm the right person for this?" Angela reached across the table, placing her hand on his arm. "Darrell, you're exactly the right person for this. Your story has already made waves in this town, but think about the impact it could have on a state level. This is an opportunity to bring about real, lasting change." Darrell sat back, running a hand over his face as he considered her words. He thought about how far he'd come since that night, about the conversations he'd started and the minds he'd changed. But he also thought about the pressure, the scrutiny, and the responsibility that came with being a voice for so many. "What if I mess up?" he asked quietly, voicing the fear that had been nagging at him since he first stepped into the spotlight. "What if I say the wrong thing or can't answer their questions?" Angela shook her head, her expression softening. "Darrell, you don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be honest, to speak from your heart like you've been doing. That's what people connect with, your authenticity, your experiences. You're not just telling a story, you're living it. And that's powerful." Darrell nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. He thought about his family, about the pride in his father's eyes when he spoke at that first community meeting. He thought about the kids in the local schools who had started to see him as a role model, who looked up to him with hope in their eyes. And he thought about Officer Bradley, who had become an unexpected ally in the fight for change. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his stomach. "I'll do it." Angela beamed at him, squeezing his arm before letting go. "That's great, Daryl. I knew you'd make the right decision. Now, let's talk about how we're going to prepare for this." As they discussed the details over lunch, Daryl felt a mix of excitement and apprehension building inside him. This was bigger than anything he'd done before, but he knew it was a chance to make a real difference. And that was worth facing any fear. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Daryl worked with Angela to refine his speech, practiced in front of mirrors in small groups, and tried to anticipate the kinds of questions he might face. But even as he prepared, life in the town continued to evolve. One evening, as Daryl was locking up the garage, he heard the sound of a car pulling up behind him. He turned to see Officer Bradley stepping out of his patrol car, a hesitant smile on his face. "Evening, Daryl," Bradley greeted him, his voice friendly but tinged with nervousness. "Got a minute to talk?" Daryl nodded, leaning against the side of the building. "Sure, Bradley. What's on your mind?" Bradley took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. "I heard about your upcoming speech at the state capitol. I wanted to let you know. I'm proud of you, Daryl. What you're doing, it's making a real difference." Daryl felt a lump form in his throat. Coming from Bradley, these words meant more than he could express. "Thanks," he managed to say. "That means a lot." Bradley nodded, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said in your speeches about the need for change within the police force. And I want to help. I've been talking to some of the other officers, and we're starting to implement some new training programs. De-escalation techniques, bias awareness, that sort of thing. It's not much, but it's a start." Daryl felt a surge of hope at Bradley's words. This was exactly the kind of change he had been hoping for, change from within the system itself. "That's great, Bradley. Really great. If there's anything I can do to help..." Bradley smiled, looking more relaxed now. "Actually, there is. We're thinking of starting a community advisory board to help bridge the gap between the police and the community. Would you be interested in being part of that?" Daryl didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. Count me in." As Bradley drove away, Daryl felt a sense of accomplishment wash over him. It wasn't just about his speeches or his upcoming appearance at the state capitol. It was about the small changes, the conversations that were happening, the minds that were opening. This was the real work of change, happening right here in his own community. The day of the speech at the state capitol arrived faster than Daryl had anticipated. As he stood backstage, adjusting his tie and running through his speech one last time in his head, he felt a familiar mix of nerves and determination. Angela was by his side, offering last-minute advice and encouragement. "Remember, Daryl," she said, her voice calm and steady, "you're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for all the people who have never had a chance to be heard. Your voice matters." Daryl nodded, taking a deep breath as he heard his name being announced. With one last reassuring smile from Angela, he stepped out onto the stage, blinking against the bright lights. The room was packed, filled with legislators, community leaders, and media from across the state. Daryl's eyes scanned the crowd, landing on familiar faces. His family, sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. Officer Bradley, standing at the back of the room, giving him an encouraging nod, and faces he didn't recognize, but who looked at him with hope and expectation. As he began to speak, Daryl felt the nerves melt away. He told his story, not just of the night he saved Bradley, but of his life growing up in a town divided by race and mistrust. He spoke of the challenges he had faced, the discrimination he had endured, and the moments of connection and understanding that had given him hope. "I stand before you today not as a hero," Daryl said, his voice strong and clear, but as a man who believes in the power of change. I believe that we can build a society where the color of a person's skin doesn't determine how they're treated by those sworn to protect them. I believe we can create a world where acts of kindness and understanding aren't newsworthy because they're so rare, but because they're so common. As he spoke, Daryl could feel the energy in the room shift. People were leaning forward in their seats, nodding along with his words. He saw tears in some eyes, determination in others. He was connecting with them, not as a polished speaker or a trained activist, but as a regular person sharing his truth. The night I pulled Officer Bradley from that burning car, I wasn't thinking about race or politics, Daryl continued. I was just doing what I hoped anyone would do in that situation. But in the aftermath, I realized that sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to show us our common humanity. We shouldn't have to wait for emergencies to see each other as people worthy of respect and dignity. Daryl went on to outline his vision for change, not just in policing, but in education, in housing, and job opportunities. He spoke of the need for open dialogue, for uncomfortable conversations that could lead to real understanding. And he called on everyone in the room to be part of that change. Change doesn't happen overnight, he said as he neared the end of his speech. It happens in small moments, in everyday interactions. It happens when we choose to listen instead of judge, to understand instead of assume. It happens when we see each other as individuals with hopes and fears, dreams and struggles, rather than as members of different races or groups. As Daryl finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. People rose to their feet, their cheers and clapping filling the air. Daryl felt overwhelmed by the response, humbled by the impact his words had made. As he left the stage, he was immediately surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand, to thank him, to share their own stories. In the days and weeks that followed, Daryl's speech became a rallying cry for change. It was shared on social media, discussed on news programs, and debated in community meetings across the state. But more importantly, it sparked action. Back in his hometown, Daryl saw the ripple effects of his words firsthand. The community advisory board that Bradley had proposed became a reality, with Daryl serving as one of its founding members. Together, they worked to improve relations between the police and the community, organizing town halls, ride-alongs, and youth outreach programs. The local schools invited Daryl to speak, and he found himself connecting with young people who saw in him a role model and a source of hope. He shared his story with them, but more importantly, he listened to theirs, encouraging them to dream big and to be the change they wanted to see in the world. Even his garage became a hub for community engagement. People would stop by not just for car repairs, but to chat, to seek advice, or to share their own experiences. Daryl found himself becoming not just a mechanic, but a mentor, a mediator, and a friend to people from all walks of life. One afternoon, as Daryl was working under the hood of a car, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps entering the garage. He looked up to see Bradley walking in, a newspaper tucked under his arm. "Hey, Daryl." Bradley greeted him, a smile on his face. "Got a minute?" Daryl wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "Sure, what's up?" Bradley unfolded the newspaper and held it out to Daryl. "Have you seen this?" Daryl took the paper, his eyes widening as he saw the headline. State Legislature passes Comprehensive Police Reform Bill. As he scanned the article, he saw his own name mentioned several times, his speech at the Capitol cited as a key factor in building support for the bill. "They did it," Daryl said softly, almost in disbelief. "They actually did it." Bradley nodded, his expression a mix of pride and determination. "They did, and it's just the beginning. There's still a lot of work to do, but this is a big step in the right direction." Daryl looked up at Bradley, seeing in his former adversary a true ally. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said, thinking back to that night on the icy road that had changed everything. Bradley chuckled, shaking his head. We sure have, and we've got a long way still to go. But I'm glad we're doing it together. As Bradley left, Daryl found himself reflecting on the journey of the past months. He thought about how far he had come from that night. From a man who just wanted to keep his head down and avoid trouble, to someone who was actively working to make the world a better place. He thought about the challenges he had faced, the fear, the doubt, the resistance from those who didn't want to see things change. But he also thought about the victories, big and small, the minds that had been opened, the hearts that had been touched, the lives that had been changed. Daryl realized that his journey was far from over. There would be more speeches to give, more battles to fight, more changes to push for. But he was no longer afraid of the road ahead. He had found his voice, his purpose, and a community of people who believed in the same vision of a better world. As he turned back to the car he had been working on, Daryl felt a sense of peace wash over him. He was still the same man he had always been, a mechanic who loved the simplicity of fixing what was broken. But now he was fixing more than just cars. He was helping to fix a system, a community, a world that had been broken for far too long. And as he picked up his wrench and got back to work, Daryl knew that this was just the beginning. The ripple effect of that one act of bravery on a dark, icy night was still spreading, touching lives and changing hearts in ways he never could have imagined. And he was ready for whatever came next, knowing that with every step forward, he was helping to build the kind of world he had always dreamed of, a world of understanding, equality, and hope. The next few months brought new challenges and opportunities. Daryl found himself traveling more, speaking at conferences and community events across the state. He shared his story and his vision for change with audiences big and small, always striving to connect on a personal level, to make people understand that this wasn't just about policies and laws. It was about human beings and their lived experiences. Back home, the changes continued to unfold. The community advisory board that Daryl and Bradley had helped establish was making real progress. They had implemented a series of workshops where police officers and community members could come together in a safe space to share their perspectives and experiences. It wasn't always easy. There were heated discussions and moments of tension. But slowly, surely, understanding began to grow. One evening, after a particularly intense workshop session, Daryl found himself sitting on a park bench with Tanya, his sister. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the town they had both grown up in, but was now changing before their eyes. You know, Tanya said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. When you first told me about that lawyer wanting you to speak up, I was scared for you. I thought maybe you were biting off more than you could chew. Daryl chuckled, remembering his own doubts and fears from those early days. Believe me, I was scared too. There were so many times I thought about backing out, about just going back to my quiet life. Tanya turned to look at him, her eyes shining with pride. But you didn't. You stepped up, Daryl. And look at everything that's happened because of it. Daryl nodded, his gaze sweeping over the park where children of all races played together, where people who might never have spoken to each other before were now chatting like old friends. It's not perfect, he said softly. We've still got a long way to go. But it's a start. As they sat there, Daryl's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Angela Pearson. Turn on the news, it read. Channel 5. Now. Curious, Daryl pulled out his phone and quickly found a live stream of the local news. His eyes widened as he saw the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Governor signs executive order establishing statewide police reform commission. As Daryl and Tanya watched the news unfold on his phone, they exchanged looks of astonishment and hope. The governor's announcement of a statewide police reform commission was a monumental step, one that Daryl had never imagined would come so soon. "Daryl," the governor said, addressing the camera directly, "if you're watching this, I want you to know that your words at the Capitol didn't fall on deaf ears. We're inviting you to be part of this commission. Your perspective is invaluable." Tanya squeezed her brother's arm, her eyes brimming with tears of pride. "You did it, Daryl. You really did it." Daryl sat in stunned silence, the weight of this new responsibility settling on his shoulders. It was one thing to speak at events and work within his community, but to help shape policy at the state level? That was a whole new ballgame. As if on cue, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Officer Bradley. "Just saw the news," the message read. "Congratulations, Daryl. If anyone can help make this commission a success, it's you. Count on my support." Daryl felt a lump form in his throat. From adversaries to allies, their journey mirrored the very change they were trying to create in the world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, Daryl realized that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult conversations and hard decisions. But looking at his sister, thinking of Bradley, and remembering all the people whose lives had been touched by this movement, Daryl knew he was ready. "Well," he said, standing up and offering his hand to Tanya, "looks like we've got work to do." 5 years later, Daryl stood at the podium in front of the state capitol, a sense of déjà vu. The journey had been long and often difficult, but it had been worth every step. He had learned that real change doesn't happen overnight or through grand gestures alone. It happens through countless small actions, through difficult conversations, and unwavering persistence. As he concluded his speech, Daryl looked to the future with optimism. He knew that there was still work to be done, challenges to be faced. But he also knew that they had laid a foundation for a more just and equitable society. Their story was far from over. It was in many ways just beginning. What would you do if you were in Daryl's shoes, suddenly thrust into the spotlight after a heroic act of saving a life? Would you embrace the unexpected recognition and use it as a platform for change? Or would you hesitate, unsure of the potential risks and impact? If you found this story of courage, unexpected twists, and personal transformation inspiring, please consider subscribing to my channel. I put my heart into creating these impactful narratives, and your support means everything to me. Thank you for joining me on this journey and for helping to bring these stories to life.